Thank you, Biswajit. Um, my remit is the marginalized sections. I was specifically only asked to deal with it, so therefore I'll disappoint Nityananda if I don't cover agriculture. Before I come to marginalized sections proper, I'll make three or four general remarks. One of them is that in the budget speech of the Prime Minister, uh, the only reference to the marginalized groups is about the tax relief scheme for the disabled, where some policy changes have been made. And the indirect references is with regard to new generation Anganwadi centers for which there is no allocation, and e-Vidya channels for dealing with the digital divide. So this shows, lack of sensitivity about marginalized groups which constitute largest section of the people. And the budget speech and the whole financial policy architecture does not deal with the core concerns of the marginalized groups and the constraints they suffer from. Second point I will make is that marginalized groups in which are included women, scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, children, religious minorities, and disabled persons, they have faced disproportionate and differential impact in several domains, not merely with regard to the pandemic as a result of the pandemic, but also with regard to the earlier policy shocks like demonetization and ill-prepared GST and all that. So, and these domains are poverty, employment, food security, health and nutrition, and the risk of violence and indebtedness. But there is so therefore there is a acute need for giving welfare support for their dignified survival. Unfortunately, the cash transfer which was provided in the first year of the pandemic was discontinued later. This cash transfer was in regard to Jan Dhan accounts, and the free food under the Prime Minister Garib Kalyan Yojana, which was provided till last year, has been discontinued. And 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 as regards Manrega, already the speakers have pointed out that the budget allocation have been reduced, which will further restrict, the possibility of giving them employment. So therefore, we find that the sections of the society which are the first sufferers have been really totally become invisible in the policy domain. The third point I would point out that, as Mr. Ashwani Mahajan has also pointed out, that unemployment is the key. And unemployment is the only route through which, provision of employment is the only route through which, both inequality can be reduced and, and also, some kind of welfare support can also come. But unfortunately, the only strategy of the government, as I understand, is public investment in public infrastructure and credit support, for self-employment. But public infrastructure, big ticket infrastructure does not really create employment. As Nitya also pointed out, is highly capital intensive. And the only infrastructure which does provide, the direct employment to the kind of people, which consist of marginalized groups, is a Manrega type of infrastructure. But because the Manrega allocation have been reduced, so that possibility is also dim. Of course, Gramin Sadak Yojana, where allocations have been increased, is a welcome point. This will certainly help to a limited extent. But as regards credit support, now one should realize that everybody cannot become an entrepreneur overnight. People who have been used to do wage labor cannot become entrepreneurs. So therefore, credit support is not a win-all situation, where you can extend credit and they will raise self-employment. Then credit-based employments have also several problems: technology problem, productivity problems, and also marketing support. But even with regard to credit support, we find that the two sources through which credit used to come is Mudra Yojana and also Startup India. In both these programs, the allocations have been reduced. The third route through which credit support was provided was emergency credit scheme for MSMEs. Now, as far as MSMEs are concerned, there are very few enterprises which are owned by scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women. And secondly, because of the impact of demonetization, GST, and also pandemic, many of the MSCs are closed. What they need is direct cash support rather than credit. So therefore, that possibility of providing employment is also nil. Now, the fourth point I will make is that these groups are concentrated in the informal sector, and many of them are migrant labor. Their plight was very glaringly visible during post-lockdown. They lack access to social security nets. They need government-funded pension and other social protection schemes. But unfortunately, the only government-funded security scheme is the NSAP, National Social Assistance Program, which is hugely underfunded. Of course, there has been a measly 5% increase in this budget, but already there is so much of unmet need, and because also this scheme, the unit cost of support is so low. It has not been revised in the 1990s, and every year, there is a clamor, for increasing the social safety net by increasing the amount of pension as well as the coverage. But this has not come to. This is very disappointing. Now, as far as marginalized groups are concerned, the first thing to be noted is that the resource flow from the government comes in two modes. One mode is the resources allocated to the ministry, which deal with the schemes directly related to the concerned group. Second mode is, and which is far more important than the ministry mode, is various other departments which deal with programs which have relevance for this section. And so therefore, all these sections have some kind of a sub-plan approach, where earmarked funds, come from those departments to these sections. But we find that with regard to the sub-plan arrangements, the whole idea has been completely defeated, because in the sub-plan arrangements, the concerned ministries are only treating it as a reporting mechanism, without ensuring that the amount that they have earmarked for this section are really spent specifically on them on need-based schemes. This does not happen. They merely assume that because they have allocated certain percentage of funds, to these groups, the benefits automatically follow. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen unless these departments formulate schemes, need-based schemes for them, and unless they ensure that physical achievement of this scheme reaches the concerned section, this will not happen. But unfortunately, these sub-plan arrangements in respect of all these sections suffer from lack of coordination, lack of monitoring, lack of coordination, and lack of linkage of physical achievement with the resource flow. The second point I will make about these groups is that many of the earlier schemes which were launched for women and children have been, particularly for women and children, have been rationalized by merging them into a single scheme. And we find that the merged scheme allocation is lower than the individual allocations of the earlier scheme. So in totality, what happens is that in the process of rationalization, these sections are getting lower resource allocation from the budget than they used to get. The third point that I would make is that the resource allocation to the ministries in respect of these sections show either a stagnant allocation or a very highly negligible increase, like 3%, 4%, 6%. This kind of small increase hardly makes any sense because schemes cannot be strengthened. Schemes, expansion of coverage cannot take place, and therefore, they remain, neglected. And we find that even with this increase, there is a decline in the percentage of allocation coming from the union budget to them. So altogether, the marginalization of these groups, gets embedded in the whole financial policy architecture. Now, so what is important is that these groups are voiceless, have no clout in policy making. They really need effective interlocutors to see that that these other competing demands do not crowd them out of consideration. Now, coming to specific marginalized groups like gender, despite the fact that there is a provision of gender responsive budgeting mechanism to see that women get their dear share, but unfortunately this mechanism has failed to address women's core issues like employment, social protection, and its risk of violence. Now, gender sensitive mechanism has two parts, 10A and 10B. Part 10A part deals with schemes which directly benefit women, and 10B deals with the scheme where a resource flow comes from other ministries, and there is a indirect benefit going to them. It doesn't linkage. It's not specifically targeted. One is specifically targeted, and other is not specifically targeted. So we find that there are a larger number of departments are making contribution in schemes which are not specifically targeted. So therefore, effort should be made to see that when other departments are allocating resources for gender-sensitive budget, they must target these groups so that the benefits to them can be ensured. Now, gender-sensitive mechanism has continued to adopt the binary approach towards gender. They have ignored the fact that transgender has been recognized as a separate gender category, but their binary category of male and female does not take that into account. So therefore, the schemes relating to transgender, particularly there are two schemes relating to transgender. We do not find their mention in the gender-sensitive mechanism. Then major problem of women as of course other marginalized groups is that particularly for women is labor force participation, which was one of the lowest in the world, 18.6%. It has increased to 22.8% recently, but this increase is in the non-paid sector, that is the family labor. So it doesn't really improve their participation. Now, with regard to labor force participation, the schemes which are required are public employment, particularly NREGA. We already have pointed out the NREGA allocation has been reduced, and particularly NREGA allocation has not merely been reduced, but it is found that there is a huge gap between the person demanding employment and the person who have received employment. Ministry's reporting mechanism points out that this percentage is 11%, but non-official reports are far higher. So therefore, when already with 93,000 crore allocation of last year, you find that there is a 11% gap in the provision of employment as against demand. You can imagine that when the allocations are reduced, there would be a further decrease in employment. And we find that even with the increased allocation, the average days of employment that is provided under NREGA is 51 or 52%. So therefore, even 100 days guarantee is not met. Now, this will get further reduced when the allocations are reduced. And we also find that even with 93,000 crore allocation last year, there are liabilities already of that year which have to be met from there. So altogether, the chances of providing more public sector employment in NREGA are weak. As regards self-employment, I have already pointed out that even the credit support which was provided by Mudra Yojana and Startup Yojana has also reduced, and emergency credit scheme, does not, really help them because very few MSMEs are owned by them. The third point I will point out that all these sections belong to the, belong to the informal sector, and this informal sector, the plight of which was glaringly reflected during the lockdown, is that they lack social security. Now, social security, it was expected that the budget will at least deal with this aspect, but unfortunately, as I pointed out, the National Social Assistance Program has ignored it. There is a measly increase of 5%. Maternity benefit scheme also, although National Food Security Act provides, that the women with is eligibility of women with two live births, but this eligibility was reduced by the government to only one eligible birth. So therefore, even the legal entitlement under the National Food Security Act has also not been met. Now, women's health issues are also a major concern, and this is reflected in the during the pandemic. Even in the vaccine coverage, only as against 100 vaccinations for the male, in case of women, only 62%. So there also, there is a kind of gap in coverage needs to be met. Besides lower vaccine coverage, there is an increase in anemia, which has been brought out by National Family Planning Survey, Family Service Survey. Now, and thirdly, there is a huge mental health problems relating to depression, violence, and stress. Now, there is a scheme in the budget, budget speech of the finance minister relating to national telemedicine program. Although the scheme does not have any allocation, but the more important point is that telemedicine, will not help them. They need, in-person consultation. They need social support. They need community support, particularly in relation to mental health. So we really need trained mental health workers. We need really trained. We need really specific mental health clinic, and we particularly really need that in the primary health centers there should be a specialist on mental health. Only then, women will be able to access. Telemedicine is not the answer. Now, the last point about the women is that the violence against them and the crime against them have increased, enormously increased. But unfortunately, the schemes for protection and safety are underfunded. Several schemes under the general category of Sambal and Samarthya, they have faced a significant reduction in the resource allocation. The Nirbhaya Fund was created specifically for dealing with violence against women. This fund this allocation remains underutilized. So altogether, in case of women, there are problems relating to low resource allocation. There are problems relating to lack of enforcement of law. There are problems relating to employment and all that. Then about the children. The children's vulnerability has tremendously increased, particularly as a result of the pandemic. And we find that the gains earlier made with regard to enrollment, with regard to food security, with regard to health and nutrition, they have been reversed. And but unfortunately, the priority to children is lacking in the budget. And though the total outlay for children has increased by 8%, but as a decline, but as a share of the union budget, there is a decline. Uh, there is also a decline in the budget of Women and Child Development Ministry. The only area where the budget provision for children has been increased is with regard to post matric scholarship under the Social Justice Ministry. Secondly, there is a new scheme announced by the finance minister relating to early childhood development scheme, under which 2 lakh new generation Anganwadi centers would be created. This is a parcel of implementation of the new education policy. But unfortunately, there is no outlay for the scheme mentioned in the program. Perhaps they will try to formulate the scheme first and then make allocation of resources. But we have found that in the past schemes are announced, but the follow-up action does not take place, and the next year and the year after they are completely forgotten. So I hope this will not happen with regard to this early childhood development scheme. Then, with regard to child health and nutrition, again under the midday meal scheme called PM Poshan, there is 11% reduction. Now, as it is during the pandemic, there was complete disruption of this scheme because the schools were closed. And now that schools are slowly getting up, it was required that at least the existing allocation should be maintained, but this has not happened. So this will affect the nutrition of children. Then, with regard to child and education, child and education receive the maximum portion of the resources under the children's budget. Now, as a result of closure of the schools and the resultant digital divide, the finance minister has announced e-Vidya channel, 200 e-Vidya channel to deal with this divide. But e-Vidya television channel, how there is no specific financial allocation for this scheme. Apparently, this scheme would be implemented by NCERT, but NCERT has such a low budget of 10 crore. How would it, if we provide resource allocation for e-Vidya channels, one does not know. But what is important is that the digital divide that has been created, and because of the devastating impact it has had on the learning of children, what we need is more in-person attention of teachers, and specific design of the programs which can fill this gap. E-Vidya channels can continue, can be created, but in-person offline arrangements are far more important. This post-matric scholarship scheme is the one area where substantial allocation have been provided. But this is because this is a demand-driven program, and it was completely choked of funds as a result of it during the past 2-3 years. The whole program was disrupted, and it has had a very very adverse effect on on those students, who are pursuing their education. Many of them had to leave, drop out, and is joined as physical labor. So, fortunately, this time, a substantial allocation has been made, and because states, many of the states were filling the gap by providing from their own resources in the hope of claiming it from the center. So there were huge areas to be provided to the state, to compensate them. So I hope, that some part of compensation to the states, for having provided them a scholarship would be done. But even now, this allocation is inadequate, is still very inadequate. But I hope that, increased budget provision will continue to be made in the coming years so that at least the demand-driven nature of this program is met. Now, child protection is the most important. I forget to mention that while the post-matric scholarship increase in allocation is welcome, but pre-matric scholarship scheme budget provision has been reduced. We find that over the years, pre-matric scholarship scheme has been very neglected in implementation as well as in resource allocation. One does not know what are the bottlenecks, but pre-matric scholarship is an important point, particularly for weaker sections and poverty-ridden sections, because it will provide some little aid, to children and to the parents, to pursue their education. Now, child protection is one area where huge attention is required. Over the years, the children's budget allocation for children were largely consumed by education and secondly by health, and child protection was relatively ignored. Fortunately, this time there has been 44.72% increase in allocation under the mission Vatsalya. But guidelines under the scheme have not been drawn even after a year. So this is called marginalization. That even where you have increased allocation under a scheme, but if the scheme itself is rotting, and guidelines have not been drawn, and the scheme has not even been started. So therefore, increased allocation would be of no avail unless expeditious action is taken to enforce the scheme. Now, second point is that child protection as a result of the violence inflicted on children is the only strategy is institutional care, where children victimized by violence can be taken care of. But there is now a feeling that we should move away from institutionalized care to non-institutionalized care. By non-institutionalized care, we mean that instead of putting them in government-run or NGO-run institutions, we should give them, for adoption, so that they can get family, environment, and personal support. But for non-institutional care, to be provided, there is an agency called CARA under Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. But the resource allocation for this particular institution has also been reduced. So therefore, non-institutional care would be a non-starter. Now, the most important point is that the specific schemes dealing with violence of children, like child labor rescue program, like cybercrime, which has increased by 260%, allocation has been reduced by 76%. Child labor rescue program allocation has been reduced by 75%, and budget for Central Social Board, which provides assistance to NGOs to deal with children's problems, their budget has also been reduced. So therefore, you find that the overall vulnerability of children and the kind of priority attention that we require, is not recognized, let alone addressed. Coming to the scheduled caste, as I pointed out, that after the distinction between plan and non-plan has been reduced, has been abolished, and planning commission has been abolished, we find that the whole sub-plan strategy, which was built up during the UPA days, has been completely subverted. Now, because the sub-plan strategy was based on percentage allocation of resources from development schemes for SCs and STs in proportion to their population. Now what has happened is that the tribal sub-plan and scheduled caste sub-plan have been renamed as Development Action Plan for SCs and Development Action Plan for STs. Now, instead of resources coming from all development schemes, to this development action plan, the new provision is that only resources from centrally sponsored schemes and central sector schemes would flow to the development action plan. So therefore, in the new framework, the total resource allocation would go towards the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe would get reduced. Many of the development schemes which are not part of the centrally sponsored scheme or central sector scheme, would not be able to would not be mandated to provide the requisite resource allocation for the tribal sub-plan and scheduled caste sub-plan. Besides, there are most important things that the total resource allocation which has come to development action plan for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. In case of scheduled caste, it is only 8.8% as against their population of around 16%. In respect of tribal sub-plan, their percentage share is 5.5% as against their population of 8%, which means that even then in the new arrangement, the total resources that they are getting from development fund is far lower than the proportion of their population. This is about the resource flow. But more important than the resource quantum of resources is the neglect in terms of ensuring that benefits of these resources reach these groups. This sub-plan arrangements have virtually become a reporting mechanism, and there is a notional reporting about their benefits reaching. There is no physical linkage of benefits accruing to the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes from the resource allocation. This will only happen when the schemes, specific need-based schemes, are specifically designed for them, and there is a monitoring mechanism to ensure that the benefits reach them. This has not happened. So therefore, sub-plan arrangements have been subverted, both with regard to the quantum of resources allocated, and secondly, with regard to the absence of need-based schemes, and thirdly, with regard to monitoring to ensure that the benefits reach them. The post-matric scholarship, as I pointed out, is a welcome step, but still even now, with substantial resource enhancement, the entire gap is not met, and therefore, being a demand-driven program and one of the oldest schemes, this scheme has been started in 1944. So therefore, this is a committed liability, and it should be ensured that adequate resource allocation should be made. And this has also been recommended by the Parliamentary Standing Committee. And pre-matric scholarship budget provision has been reduced by 1/3. It is important that the bottlenecks in respect of pre-matric scholarship should be sorted out, and adequate enforcement should take place. The second most important scheme for scheduled caste is with regard to rehabilitation of manual scavengers. This is one of the oldest program, and so many times we have announced that by a certain year all the manual scavengers would be rehabilitated, but this has not happened. The most important bottleneck now is that lack of complete and credible identification. Now, how many manual scavengers are there to be rehabilitated? On this point, there is such a wide gap between the official sources, non-official sources, and within the official sources. For example, two surveys up to November 21 mentioned 58,000 manual scavengers. Uh, census data to 2011 mentioned 26 lakh latrines, dry latrines, which means they are being serviced, by manual scavenger. So therefore, their number would be far larger. Then social and economic caste census identified 1.68 lakh manual scavengers in rural areas. They have no data about the urban areas. Then 2018 survey recently carried out pointed out that there are only 42,303 manual scavengers. So you find that there is such a large gap, such a large difference in the identification within the official count. And if you deal with non-official surveys, then the gap is huge. So one does not understand what is standing in the way of reconciling these figures in order to see that the manual that the scheme is implemented. The second point is that under the Swachh Bharat program sanitation, large number of rural latrines have been created, and now urban latrines have also been created, which is very welcome. One would have hoped that manual scavenging, would be abolished, but unfortunately, because of the fact that and where dry latrines have been created, where under Swachh Bharat sanitary latrines have been created, there is a reluctance on the part of the householders, to clean these latrines. So therefore, they again depend upon manual scavengers, to do that. So therefore, even a sanitation program supposedly meant, to abolish manual scavenging is getting instrumental in extending, manual scavenging. This is very important. Unless the householders learn and agree and are willing and are mandated, to clean their own latrines, they will continue to oppress, scheduled caste, to clean their latrines, and the problem will never end. So this aspect, that is improvement of the condition of manual scavengers, abolition of the condition of manual scavengers must become an integral scheme. It must ensure that householders must clean their own latrines for this purpose. Second point is that it has been pointed out by the ministry that the manual scavengers which were identified have all been rehabilitated, which have been identified have all been rehabilitated with cash assistance of 40,000 rupees and a skill development program. But the non-official claim is that only 2.7% or 3% have received this assistance. So even with regard to the assistance provided by the ministry under the scheme, there is such a huge gap. So, but one really does not understand why a simple scheme like this is creating such a problem of lack of coordination and lack of reconciliation. So this needs enforcement. As regards scheduled tribes, as I pointed out, their share of allocation under the CSSSS is only 5.5%. But the more important point that scheduled tribes is the most neglected category of all groups. And this is because, Their problems are not merely resource flow, their problems are relating to the enforcement of their rights, Forest Rights Act, Land Rights Act, rehabilitation of displaced persons. Now, unless these rights are implemented, mere resource-based schemes will not be able to improve their condition, because development programs in other sectors are making adverse effects on them. There is no filtering mechanism to see that the adverse effects of other development programs, are adequately addressed. There is no mechanism. So therefore, what we require is that not merely enhanced resource flow for the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe as well as other weaker sections. What we require is a filtering mechanism whereby the adverse effects of other development programs on the particularly on the scheduled tribes are adequately addressed. And thirdly is that the specific rights of the scheduled tribes with regard to forest and land must be enforced, because studies have pointed out that the condition of tribals in the northeast is far better than the condition of tribals in other fifth scheduled states. This is because the land rights and forest rights of the tribals in northeast are far better protected than they are protected in the fifth scheduled area. So therefore, protection is an important part of their development. Protection and development cannot be separated, particularly in relation to scheduled tribes. And it's also in relation to scheduled caste, because both of them suffer, atrocities, and the incidence of atrocities is increasing. And because the implementation of Atrocities Act is highly constrained by lack of resources, we need more special courts, we need more and public prosecutors, we need strengthened machinery and all that. Now, with regard to religious minorities, there is a decline in outlay as a percentage of union budget from 0.14% to 0.12%, despite a very negligible increase of 4% in the budget of the ministry. Now, there are two strategies for religious minorities for their development. One is a 15-point program of the Prime Minister, which deals with education, employment, and improvement in living standards. And second is the multi-sectoral development program. Both programs suffer from huge problem with regard to 15-point program. The requirement is that 15% of funds should flow from other development ministries to the minorities. Although the strength of the minority is 21%, but only 15% funds are to be flown from them. But this is happening only with regard to 3 or 4 departments. So there is a lack of effort, to see that more and more departments should allocate resources for minorities under the 15-point program. But the more important part is that there is a lack of specific earmarking under the central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes for minorities. And really is that earlier ministries used to report about the share of minorities in employment budgetary allocation. This has been discontinued. But the most important program of the ministry was scholarship. But scholarship programs suffer from very poor coverage and low unit cost. This has not been devised. The worst part is that the unit cost and coverage with regard to scheduled caste, scheduled tribes and minorities are so different. This is absolutely unacceptable. Thirdly is that Prime Minister had announced 2 years back that there will be 1 crore scholarship, under the for minorities. But as against them, even after 2 years, there is only 52% persons under the post-matric scholarship and 36% 0.7%, and the pre-mentorship have received this scholarship. So this gap remains, which shows the lack of adequate resource allocation. Lastly, is that persons with disabilities, the most neglected section. There is only one reference to the insurance scheme for tax relief that has pointed out. There are only under this scheme also it is required that resource should flow from the other department, but other departments are not. Only 4 departments have disaggregated data for the disabled person, but all of them show decline in their budget provision. There is a marginal increase of 3% allocation for the department. But the last point that I make is that there is there are only 2 important schemes of the department. One is the distribution of assistive devices. National Sample Survey has pointed out that of all the persons who have received assistive devices, only 5.9% have received it from the government program. The remaining persons have received it from the private channel, which is a pity. It's the oldest scheme. I really don't understand what stands in the way of a government scheme reaching the people. That is one point. The second important scheme is the cash compensation for pension as a pension scheme for social protection. This is also a very low coverage of 7.6%. And even unit costs have also not been revised. So we find that in respect of all the marginalized sections, there is not, they suffer from lack of attention and sensitivity, voicelessness, and which is reflected in inadequate resource flow and also adequate enforcement of their program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And let me now invite Dr. Indranil Mukhopadhyaya, last but not the least, and you'll have the last word, please. Thank you.